Welcome to. I'm gonna claim ownership of this. So welcome to the first ever Eminent Americans live chat. You are hereby anointed a eminent American by virtue of the power vested in me by the U.S. Supreme Court. Even though you're a South African who's now living in the UK, is that right?
Yes, although I'm also a naturalized British citizen by now, so
Is that a
I
is that a difficult process to be?
yeah, so I came here on the equivalent of like an H-1B visa. I guess it's been a bit of controversy, I think, in the US recently. So
Yeah, we don't want
um
your kind anymore. But you know,
well, you do actually. I've seen pictures in the New York Times about, Afrikaners being welcomed by the president. So you do want you maybe
it's a
you
good point.
don't want my kind, but some other people actually do, Dan. So yeah, that's been an interesting reversal of fortunes. But yeah, to answer your question, so I came here on like a work permit, and actually I think comparatively it's quite easy because if you are a professional and you have a work permit for 5 years, you can then get indefinite leave to remain and you can apply for citizenship a year after. Um, that is part of the reason why, and Andrew Sullivan actually loves to bring up this fact that I think the statistics, and he quotes this number, so I don't actually know how accurate it is still, but that something like only 40% of the population of London was even born in the UK. So it truly is a
Right.
cosmopolitan city. And obviously, that kind of tells you a lot about the sort of background to things like Brexit,
Yeah.
etc., because a lot of these people were like Europeans, obviously coming over, and lots of Polish people to do all like the trade jobs, etc. And that was sort of the first rise of populism in the UK, at least,
Yeah.
against this threat of further immigration. But so I always see myself in this very odd sort of position because on the one hand, yes, I am an immigrant and I had to go through the formal channels. But I also know I'm the kind of immigrant that, most people don't have a problem with.
Right. Right. You are a sort of like native adjacent or something like that. I'm not sure what the terminology would be.
Well, it's
You're
interesting because it's like because that is something I've been thinking a lot about is I don't know if you saw the movie Past Lives.
No, I don't think so.
Yeah, so that's like Celine's song, I think it's 2023. It's a really good movie. It's about a woman that was born in Korea, and the first scene is like a little childhood romance between her and a boy. And then her family moves to America. And then 20 years or so later, this guy gets in touch with her. And by this time, she's an American, she has a white boyfriend, she has a whole different life. And the movie is basically this reflection on the fact that, she could have had a whole different life there. And how do you even begin to think about, would it have been a better life? What does
Yeah.
that even mean? So when you say something like native adjacent, it's funny because I feel like even though I've been in this country for like 8 years now, I feel almost like increasingly that I can sense like deep differences
Hmm.
that I even though I'm a British citizen, I don't think I'll ever call myself British.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, it's like I also don't have really an emotional attachment to the label South African. And I think it's one of the reasons why I'm always interested in these sort of liminal figures or marginal figures, like Andrew Sullivan, who kind of, because obviously he's an immigrant to the US as well.
Yeah.
And an interesting thing that I've been thinking about with regards to that is a lot of the, because it's like I keep like tabs on his Substack notes now, and it's like every now and again I'm like, okay, yes, good, good. Like you're standing up for free speech, you're like standing up against Trump, and then he'll kind of complain about the number of biological women on Grindr, and then I'm like, oh no, Andrew, no, like. get away from that. But in terms of, because I know you got some pushback when you said we're talking about Andrew Sullivan, because some people just don't even want to, like, go near him.
Yeah,
And I think one has to give the devil its due. Like, he is not some of these other people that have just jumped on the Trump train, and especially on an issue like Israel, which is very, very sensitive. He has, like, put Barry Weiss and the Free Press's feet to the fire, and says, like, listen, like, you can't have made this whole thing about free speech for like a decade now, and then all of a sudden say, yeah, well, do we really want people criticizing another government that we're friendly to in our country as students? And the fact that this is even a conversation, I
yeah,
feel, is why I think someone like Andrew Sullivan, who has 200,000 subscribers on Substack, so he's not some marginal voice. I think it is important to kind of recognize when, he still stands up for what is right, and it's not necessarily what his audience wants to hear. And I think part of the reason why the citizens question is so important to him as well, because I don't know all the legalities, but I understand one of the reasons why it took it so long to get a green card and citizenship in the US is because of his HIV
right.
status.
Yeah.
Because and I don't know, there might still be laws on the books in terms of these things that the US can just bar entry for anybody that's HIV positive. And I
I
think
think
these
it's
kind
not
of
on the book. I think that is not on the books anymore. Do you think it still is? I thought
No,
maybe they
sorry.
got.
So I don't know. So
I think they
but
got
I
rid of
know
that.
it was for a long
It was for a long
time.
time. Yeah. Yep.
And the same thing for like things like whether you can donate blood as a gay person. There was like a lot of
Yeah.
discussions and all of these things. And I think um what I've appreciated by Andrew Sullivan is the fact that he made a lot of these things like personal, in the sense
Yeah.
like he talked about things that affected his own life and talked about it in an honest way.
Well, I
And
mean, let's go back. I want to go back to the. I mean, I want to get into the nuances, but I mean, let's go back to the beginning in a sense, not the beginning of Andrew Sullivan, but the beginning of our respective relationships with him. I mean, one way, unidirectional relationships. He's not thinking a lot about us, or at all for that matter. Though I'm still hopeful that he'll drop into this. We did tag him multiple times just to let him know that it was happening.
yeah,
Um, you know, I'm 49, so I think you're in your 30s, right? So I'm older than you.
yes.
I'm a straight guy. I'm American. You're South African, but now a citizen of the UK. You're gay. I'm trying to remember when I first encountered Andrew. So Andrew, I mean, I'm assuming everybody on here knows, but I also might disseminate this as a podcast. I mean, Andrew came to my attention as this when he was editor, I think named editor in chief of the New Republic. I don't know if he came to if I was aware, if I was that tuned in that I knew when he was named editor in chief. But when I first became aware of him, he was this, and the quick tagline on him was he was a gay conservative, right, or a
Mm.
gay Catholic conservative, right. So he's somebody who grew up in, I think, a relatively working class home in the UK, is it a small town in England? You may know better than me, but it's not. Well, he didn't grow up in London, so he grew up
No,
kind
it's
of out,
south of England, yeah.
outside the sort of metropole in England. Was a scholarship boy, or no, was a scholarship boy at Oxford, but was not. I think went to what they call grammar school, a kind of magnet school in the US
Yeah, and I
context.
think that's actually an important point just to pause on, because I think that's like very important to kind of understand the Andrew Sullivan origin story, because he
Yeah,
talks about this a lot. And I think part of the reason why it's easy to develop a fascination with Andrew Sullivan as a person is because he gives you so much material. You can just like
right,
listen to an interview of him ostensibly interviewing somebody else, and he spends half of the time talking about himself. So,
right.
so if it sounds like I'm obsessive about him, it's really not. Like, listen to two of his interviews, and you can kind
Well,
of understand a lot of this.
I'm willing to cop to being obsessive is the wrong word. I've just been a follower and a fan of his for, I think, going on decades now. right?
Mm.
So he grew up, he was a working class boy, he was good at school. I think he realized relatively young that he was gay, though he didn't come out till much later. Goes to grammar school, does
Yeah.
exceptionally well,
And,
goes
and
to
yeah, sorry,
Oxford.
that so the point
Yeah,
with the grammar school that I wanted to make is the fact that the way it worked back then is you wrote a test, like an IQ test
right,
basically, at the age of 12. And the brightest kids in the region could then go to this grammar school, which was a publicly funded school, but it was the idea was the same kind of quality education that was normally reserved to the upper classes, the people who go to Eton and these schools. And what then started happening in the 1970s, like I think just after he had gone to that grammar school, is that the Labour government at the time said, well, this is unequal outcomes. Because
right.
now you've got some government schools that are prestigious, and you've got these other crappy schools, and you're distinguishing between kids and saying these are the elites that will go to these schools, and the rest will go to the public schools. So those were abolished in the name of equality. And he felt that that was a he uses the word radicalized. He says that radicalized him because he felt these were in the name of equality, you were actually taking away opportunities from working class kids like him. And I
Yeah,
think that is quite important to understand his reaction to things like affirmative action, etc. Because um, there's the same kind of rationale to say that we've got unequal outcomes. That's why we need to kind of put the thumb on the scale. And he has always resisted the thumb on the scale.
yeah. Well, no, that's a good point. And I think it was only recently that I sort of heard him talk about that experience with the grammar schools, and I mean his attachment to them, and then his kind of horror at their abolishment. So he goes. I'm just trying to take people through the biography
Mm-mm.
because I'm thinking of it in a sort of podcasty way. Like he goes to Oxford, he does exceptionally well. I'm not sure. I think he did spend some time working in journalism in the UK before he comes over to the US for his graduate degree in government at Harvard, and then is hired. And I apologize to everyone for the, I don't have the, you know, the minutia of this, but ends up at the New Republic, very young, named the editor. And I think, as he puts it, kind of was accidentally outed. He was out. He was kind of out in his private life, but was not kind of out publicly. And I think was a little bit accidentally outed in the sense that I think he's talked about this. Somebody just asked him, maybe it
Mm.
was known in sort of journalistic circles that he was gay, and somebody was profiling him because he was this young Brit who'd just been named to this pretty important position in sort of journalism in Washington politics at the head of the New Republic. They asked him about his sexuality, and he just like kind of at the moment just was honest about it. And so then he was
Well,
kind
I
of,
mean, I think I will slightly nuance that because, sorry, I just have my article that I wrote about in front of me. So I have some more of the dates, because he actually published this article, making the conservative case for gay marriage in the New Republic, and that was in 1989. And he had written a number of articles on gay issues with them before he became editor in 1991.
okay, all
So
right.
I guess it was in that context. It was like, okay, so a little
You're going to
suspicious
real
that like
time
every
fact check
single
me.
article you write is like about gay topics. So
Okay.
I think it was like an obvious
We're gonna
question.
have to get past the biography into our just our feelings about Andrew, because I don't think my grasp of the facts are strong enough to hold this down. Uh, what I was gonna say, I want to get quickly to sort of your experience of him. I mean, I encountered him in a relatively sort of neutral sense. He's this kind of interesting odd bird. He's a gay conservative, which was an odd thing to process at the time in the '90s. And when I really cathected to Andrew was when he launched his first iteration of the dish, of his what was
Mm,
at the time his daily blog. And I think and I'm trying to remember when, and he really was a pioneer in that sense. He wasn't the first person to blog, but he did it extraordinarily well and extraordinarily prolifically. So it was this new experience of consuming news, where every day I would go, to his site, and there would be, and I think pretty quickly, or maybe immediately, he had some people working for him, which enabled some of the sort of productivity. But you could check back in through the course of the day, and it was this incredible mix of like little notes linked to other things, that were other things that were interesting, 400 to 500 mini essays. And so all of a sudden, really for the first time, because I think most of the other blogs that I was locked into were not sort of 24/7 in that way. They were
Mm,
like, they were you were engaging with politics and commentary, but it wasn't like of the second of the moment. For the first time, I formed this relationship to this person who's filtering and mediating the news for me every day, multiple times a day, and is really my entry point in a sense to kind of what's not like both what's going on in the world, like what's happening in Iraq, what's happening in Iran, what's happening in gay marriage, but also like what's happening in the journalistic intellectual scene. Like it was the first place that I encountered Ta-Nehisi Coates. I
mm,
was when Andrew Sullivan somehow, and I don't know, he found him somehow found something that Coates had posted to his own blog. He wasn't at the Atlantic yet. I think he ended up at the Atlantic in no small part because Andrew started promoting him. So that's where I first encountered Ta-Nehisi Coates. I don't know if it's where I first encountered Matt Iglesias or Ezra Klein, but it's probably where I first kind of got to know people like that. So it's this entry point to this whole intellectual, journalistic, political world, and Andrew was the vehicle for that, and he was this very charming, as you said, like charming, obnoxious, excessive, but even the obnoxiousness was kind of out there in a way, right? So he's hardcore promoting the Iraq war and attacking anybody who questioned the wisdom of going to war for years. And then the Iraq war goes, totally implodes and is clearly a total disaster. And unlike somebody like Christopher Hitchens, who I also was a fan of, who was just do or die with the Iraq War to the end, Andrew has this dark night of the soul. It's like, I fucked up. The Iraq War is a disaster. We're torturing people. That's a disaster. That's a betrayal of all of our principles. I'm going to reckon personally, politically, intellectually with all of the failures that led to us making this catastrophic decision. And that was really like so all of this over many years. I mean, you know, like when I talk about cathecting, I mean, this is a person whose voice, it's almost like what's the psychological, like an introject, like whose voice lived in my brain for a long time. And it's a powerful connection. And I'm aware of that as people are sort of like, why are you talking about this guy? He's this, he's anti-trans, he's racist, he's anti-Semitic, all of the things, all of the things, the accusations that people lob at him. And my first instinct is always, and I want to be really open about this in the spirit of Andrew Sullivan, like my first instinct is always not to defend the specific thing, but to defend Andrew in a sort of broad sense. And I can't exclude from that, I'm trying to be introspective about it. Like, he's a person who's profoundly important to me personally for all those, reasons that I just illuminated, and others that, maybe we'll get into. But I'm
yeah.
curious about
I
your, I mean,
mean,
I'll stop, and
yeah,
I kind of want to hear about the beginnings of your, I'm going to say love affair, but you can nuance that. Like the beginnings that were, or the evolution of your relationship to Andrew. I guess it's not
y-
with Andrew, but your personal
yeah.
relationship to Andrew.
Um, I just want to start by saying, I think I'm much less charitable in my first instinct than you are.
Okay.
In terms of that where you say when people say, "How can you talk to this person?" My first instinct is, "Well, who the hell are you?" Like, I think what I admire of people like Andrew Sullivan is they put their lives on the line in the sense they live openly, they air their dirty laundry in public, and that is why you can go and say, well, he was really a dick there, he shouldn't be doing this, he's not learning, all of these things, because in a sense he's been thinking in public. And
Right.
that is what, especially writing, and this is interesting, that I found just when I started writing on Substack, just realizing the difference between just absorbing information and saying, oh, now I'm going to write something to give my view and put my view out there.
Yeah.
And there's obviously been a lot of discussion around like Substack and legacy media, and but it is, yeah, it is a little bit weird in the sense that it's sort of as if we just had these magazines and everybody read them, and then all of a sudden Substack came along and, wrecked everything, which is
Right.
obviously
Right.
like not remotely what happened, because like you just said, we had this whole period of blogging, the golden era, where a lot of people came up from I think like people like Ezra Klein, Matty Glazes, none of them had like an institutional
Right.
background to
That's
begin
right.
with. Obviously, there were several cycles. Then they got basically headhunted by these organizations. So it's actually very similar to like almost like a Silicon Valley type of mentality because you have this experimentation. Um, People just throw things out there. Obviously, things resonate with people.
Yeah.
And obviously, the things that resonate is not necessarily what the legacy media thinks resonates
Right.
because and that is proven by the fact that you then get people who become, like you said, your portal to the news
Right.
because you're like, rather than go to the New York Times and like read through the articles and trying to figure out, okay, is this a fair assessment of the situation, are they leaving anything out, you kind of, and I feel, and you, to put it negatively, you're almost like lulled into a false sense of security because you're like, I trust this person. I'm just gonna basically ask them, what should I think about this?
Yeah.
Um, and obviously, I'm not. That's not what we tell ourselves. We tell ourselves we're independent thinkers and etc. But there is this. What I've been wondering about. I've been working on this piece inspired by Matthew Gazda's The Sleepers. I don't know if you've read that.
That's the novel. That's his new novel. No, I
Yeah,
haven't
his
read
new
it. Yeah.
novel.
I've
Yeah.
read a few of his plays, but I know I haven't read the
Yeah,
novel.
I
Yeah.
haven't read any of his plays. His novel is really, it's one of those things that I don't say it often, but it really grows on
Hmm.
you. And I don't know if it's because I was like wrestling with it in my head because I wanted to write something about it. But anyway, one of the things he writes about there, because there's this main character, Dan, they call Dan,
Hmm.
leftist academic, that and there's is really scathing in terms of the narration of this character because it basically says his mind is made up of porn and politics,
Yeah.
but and the way it's described is like he needs this chatter in his head. So you
Hmm.
know that line from Pascal that basically says that all of the evils of humankind is because you can't sit alone with your thoughts in a room.
Yeah.
And and that's because the reason why I've been puzzling about this question is um if you look at sort of my media consumption, I tend to like if it's something like a podcast that I put on, like when I'm doing dishes or whatever, then it is people like Andrew Sullivan. It is people with like a more conservative bent that I tend to go for.
Yeah.
Even though if you looked at like the objective facts in my life, like I by no means live a life that like most conservatives would approve of.
Yeah.
And so there is this question of chatter, and I don't know to psychoanalyze myself. It is something to do with the fact that I come from such a conservative environment. I grew up in that. I rebelled against that
You're
very
saying when you say
strongly.
that environment, you talking about your family, the sort of community you're part of, both?
Yes, but because um, so my so I joked before about like my kind of people being let into the US, but it's obviously because I am an Afrikaner, I'm Afrikaans speaking, that was my home language. That was the language that I spoke to basically everybody that I knew on an intimate level until I was like 18 years old. I didn't have English speaking friends until I went to university. Um, I went to an all Afrikaans primary school and high school, and the way that that works is that is a form of de facto segregation because there isn't a an exclusion based on race, but the fact that most people, at least where I grew up, who spoke Afrikaans were white.
Right.
So the school was about 98, 99% white in a country that is 13% white.
Right. Right.
So that I think has a number of kind of implications in the sense that although it was a government school, because it was like so strongly about this kind of community, there was also like a very, very strong Christian evangelical influence, like in the school itself. Like we
Yeah.
would have school assemblies and people would basically come and talk about these visions that they had and how we need to give our lives to Jesus. So it was like really kind of when I describe it to like people in the UK who a lot of them my age grew up with basically no religion,
Yeah.
it sounds like growing up in a cult.
Yeah.
And there was a sort of excessive reaction to the outside world, really, which again I can sort of psychoanalyze to say, like, obviously was a lot of uncertainty in the 1990s. At the time, it was a transition from the apartheid regime to the new South Africa.
Yeah.
And there was a real fear that it will just erupt in civil war. I mean, Rwanda happened in 1994, the exact same year that the transition happened in South Africa. But again, I think the cultural ways in which those anxieties were expressed were a lot of the time this um you know clinging to what you have. So
Sure.
like I said, the politics around language became very important, but also on an intimate level, I felt it obviously as someone who realized quite early that I was gay, probably when I was like 13 to 14, and by the time I was 15, I knew for sure. But so I had a very strong sense that this environment is not for me.
Right.
This is not the
Yep.
type of environment that I can thrive in. So, um, but it's funny because, like I said, as I grow older, you kind of realize that, wow, like nostalgia is a bitch in a sense. You grow nostalgic about things that,
Right.
if I think logically about it, I know at the time all I wanted to do is like get out of that place and get out of that mindset. Um, but then I feel like I've now kind of seen the other side, like I said, living in a city like London. Whereas in a lot of ways, I love my life here and I don't know how I could live somewhere else where there isn't so much practical individual freedom. And I think that's where, again, I sometimes get frustrated by the type of internet conversations, especially in America when they talk about the UK, because yeah, there are ridiculous cases of like people being like hounded at their
Right.
houses if they've made a tweet or something. But then that get twisted into, oh, the UK has fallen, we might as well be China, etc.
Right.
And obviously, I feel that kind of dynamic is also what is playing out with this whole Afrikaner genocide thing. Whereas, again, it's something that is a fear. And
So,
the reason why people sorry, let me just the
yeah.
reason why people have this fear, like within South Africa, of this is obviously because of the experience of countries like Zimbabwe,
Right.
where it actually happened,
Yeah.
and I remember it very clearly because that was when I was about in high school, and there was this thing about all of these people fleeing to South Africa, basically, including black farm workers, because there was no
Right.
work in Zimbabwe,
Right.
because the economy collapsed. And the only reason why it wasn't a humanitarian tragedy is because South Africa is so much richer than any other country in the region that it was able to basically absorb that.
Yeah.
And yes, that also causes tensions. There's also anti-immigrant sentiment that is in South Africa at the moment. But again, it's like the sort of thing where these things are very delicately balanced, and people on the ground kind of make compromises and come to
Yeah.
solutions. And then it's really disheartening to then see someone from the outside use that as
Sure.
for their own political agenda.
Let me ask you something, because this is I was thinking about when you were talking about your own childhood, which is, and I'm not sure I'd thought of it, my relationship to Andrew in this way, but as you were talking, I think, and maybe you've said this before, like, how much of when you started reading him was a process of identification? Like, I'm imagining there was a process of identification but like for me it was not a process of identification in the sense that I did not look at Andrew and say, yes, that is a life like mine. I think for me it was a process of expansion. So for me, reading him and the way that he lived in the world was like, this is another possibility for a way to be that I find very appealing. I mean, the openness, also not his sexuality in the sense that like, oh, I could be gay, but his way of being a man in a way that was like, this is a different way I could be in the world as a man, right? Like expanding
Mm.
my conception of what masculinity was, and this is a different way I could be a writer than I am now. So all of these things were like, for me it was a, I'm sure there was some identification, but a lot of it was a process of expansion or alternatives. I'm kind of imagining from what you're saying that not that there was none of that, but that there was also a process of identification, right? He is somebody who was like, a gay kid from a world that was just not, the world he came up in was not hospitable to him. And then it's kind of going out into this different, larger world and trying to sort of craft a kind of individual eh, identity for oneself, when you weren't handed that um, by the community you grew up in. I mean, is that right? I mean, or am I sort of imagining that part of when
I
you
mean,
started reading him was a process of kind of identification, that he's like me or I'm like him?
yeah, I mean it's interesting because I don't think I've ever seen him like as a gay role model, and I think
Mm.
it's probably a matter of at what time of my life I sort of started engaging with
Well,
him.
what drew you to him?
Um,
You're the one who said we should talk about
yeah, so
him.
I've been really thinking about it. If you think about it, I think it was probably just around 2016 where I had at that time spent a lot of time on YouTube and Twitter. Like I never tweeted, but I was like following a lot of people. And I think this was obviously in retrospect, like sort of the beginning of like some really crazy things happening in terms of politics and I think what drew me to figures like him was, I guess, a personal kind of dissatisfaction with leftism, which is obviously now the oldest story in the book. Um, because I think my activity online, I can sort of see like it kind of traces what I was sort of interested in at the time. So when I started reading blogs, it was really around atheism and science, because obviously growing up Christian,
Mm.
um, I Richard Dawkins' The God Delusion was like an incredibly important book for me because that kind of gave me the confidence, I guess, to say that even though everybody in my family believes this, everybody at school, all the like universities have theological faculties, and it's just like, but no, you've got nothing. And that's how I felt at the time, because especially the kind of Christianity I grew up with was it was Calvinist, and again, like I said, it had an impact on even the school curriculum. In biology class, we were taught like evolution is only a theory. So
Right.
like I said, really the kind of things you associate with like the
So
really
you came to
redneck
him.
American South.
It's interesting because I didn't, the sort of this round of culture wars, the wokeness, anti-wokeness, that was not not in a lot of ways the context, through which I came to him. But you're saying you
Mm.
came to him when we were sort of like the Great Awakening, this sort of period of kind of rising, you know, social justice activism, anti-racist, activism, consciousness raising, and you came to him as somebody who is a relatively early voice of discontent or dissent from the sort of consensus that was coalescing or had coalesced.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Because I think I first saw that within those kind of atheist blogs, because
Yeah,
there was this movement called Atheism Plus. Because the thing is, people realize that okay, it's very fun. Because at the start of the internet, people love debating religion, because you hear all the atheists screaming at all the Christians, and the Christians saying that these guys are going to hell, and then they're saying, "Oh, look how charitable the Christians are." But over time, it's like if you build your whole identity about what you're against,
yeah,
then all of these people that all of a sudden had these atheist clubs and they're spending all of their time on atheist blogs, some of them started saying, but okay, but like there are actually problems in my life that even though now I'm atheist, that doesn't solve them. And that's when people came like, oh, but what about racism? What about sexism? And saying like, our atheism needs to be more than that. And on the other hand, you had and that was the proverbial, fedora wearing, guy that says like the purist and says, no, we're talking about philosophy here. We're talking about
Oh,
atheism.
that's
We're not, take away the social
so
justice
you were
things.
enough a part of this kind of atheist subculture that you could kind of watch in real time because I just wasn't plugged into it. Like,
Mm,
I mean, I
mm,
knew
mm.
Dawkins and Hitchens, but
I
I
mean,
wasn't.
I know
You could watch in real time
exactly.
as
Yeah, yeah. It was real time because there was even a name for it. It was called Elevator Gate because there was this conference of these. No, listen, there was this.
Elevator Gate. Okay.
Yeah, because there was, I think her name is Rebecca Watson. She was known by like the moniker Skeptic or something, and she was in the Skeptic podcast because that was the kind of podcast that I listened to at the time because I was interested, and they would like, not only debunk religious claims but also things like UFOs, etc.
Yeah. Yeah.
So.
Yep. Yep.
Um, and so they had this conference and they had, like these things are, and people then go and have a drink. And she said that she got into the elevator to go to her room, and some guy was there and he started speaking to her. And he asked her if she wanted to have a drink in his room. And she had posted on about this on the internet. I don't know if it was a tweet at the time or what it was, and basically go on about how that was inappropriate and was an unsafe space. That became a whole, it's like a proto Me Too in that sense. And Richard Dawkins actually got involved, and he had this very sarcastic tweet that says, he said Muslima, so his name for a woman in the Muslim world is to say, oh, don't feel bad about your um, oppression. Women in the West, sometimes they're in an elevator and they get approached by a nerdy guy and they have to turn him down. you know and that kind of, and you can see there is obviously also this tension between like the male point of view and the kind of feminist point of view. And I think um I also, because I always say to people they shouldn't be simplistic in their thinking, so I also want to avoid just saying everything is a problem of feminism. But I have to say there's a lot of things that I wrote about this when I wrote about like queer politics, where because people have been wondering, where did all of this madness come from? Why did all of the liberals all of a sudden just go for wokeness? Is it Foucault? Is it the usual suspects? And Joseph Heath, who writes a very interesting Substack which talks about political philosophy, he wrote this post and saying that actually part of the problem is within liberalism itself, within like academia, there became this movement to redefine things like rights and harms.
Yeah.
Because according to traditional political liberalism, um, you have certain freedoms, freedom of speech, freedom of association, etc. You get protected from other people if they cause you harm. But if someone just says something to you that you don't like, you don't have a case against them. But then, and he,
Wait, I have to.
yeah, sorry.
MJ, I have to because I have to run out for a minute and get the charger so my phone doesn't die. If anybody,
Okay.
so you're gonna have to monologue, but if anybody in the chat wants to ask any questions of you, sorry, this is the
Okay,
problem with a
great.
live chat. But I'm gonna
Okay,
get so if
that's,
anybody has any questions in the chat, I'll be back. But I will say when we get back, I want to see if I can redirect us to Andrew
yeah,
Sullivan because I think we got a little off track. Um,
yeah.
because Andrew's fast. Anyway, I'll be right back.
Yeah. Okay. So to complete my my story about how feminism is to blame, is Joseph Heath basically argues that this expansion of the idea of harm and rights means that if you can claim that something is a right, then that means that you don't have to tolerate people who don't respect the right that you have. And he links this to like anti pornography campaigns and anti sex work campaigns, because this is obviously an interesting something that I've also been interested in is like these tensions within feminism about, for example, sex. Sex positive, sex negative. You obviously have then trans exclusionary feminism and radical feminism, and I guess to bring it back to like Andrew Sullivan on this point, I guess for me it's almost like on an intellectual level, it's been interesting to see how these debates have evolved and how you have strange bedfellows. Whereas you have someone like Andrew Sullivan now that you said became famous as a gay Catholic. Now his crusade in terms of gender politics seem to be increasingly anti-trans, and that puts him like in um, cahoots with people who are traditionally radical feminists
Yeah.
who don't actually get along with gay men in general. And that's why a lot of the tension, and that's why what I try to keep on telling people is when it's this question of queer politics, it's really not a matter of gay versus trans, because I know there's been an uptick in all of these things in youth gender. It's a very controversial issue. But actually, what you're talking about mostly about the conversation is like splits within gay men and lesbians, how they think about it. And I think that is where Andrew Sullivan has become such a lightning rod, because he is one of the and I think he was one of the early voices to kind of speak up against what he saw as like a trans overreach. Just like in the 1990s, he was one of the only prominent, obviously, editors of magazines willing to touch something like Charles Murray's The Bell Curve. And
Yeah.
I think, to be honest, that is probably also how I became um, interested in him, because I began reading about like all of this, these issues about IQ and race and all of the politics behind it. Because again, it's something that, um, as someone who grew very attached to this idea of rational inquiry, because that was sort of what got me out of this fundamentalist religious mindset and
Yeah.
the way that that was used to justify all kinds of things. I was very suspicious when all of a sudden people turned around and said, "Oh, but that science is race science, so you can't touch that."
Right.
And to me, I've always been trying to figure out, okay, but what is the consistent principle that you're applying here to say this is legitimate science and this is a pseudoscience, or this is the kind of thing that we can't discuss in a public magazine?
Right.
And it's taken me a long while to kind of realize that actually that is the wrong way, I think, to frame the argument, because I think the people who don't want to talk about these issues, I might be wrong, but I think I just don't see that it's really a scientific opinion at the end of the day. It is more of a idea that some things are better discussed among experts and some things that, and because I'm
Well, wait.
thinking
I mean,
of,
I
yeah.
want to. I want to. I guess I sort of want to make it more personal in a way, because I feel
Mm,
like, and I mean, I'm thinking about Andrew, and I kind of started this by saying like when he's attacked, I feel attacked, right? And I want to be
mm,
conscious of that. And I so I think the larger question is, or a larger question for me. I don't want to say this is a larger question for you is, partially what are people arguing about when they're arguing about these things, like emotionally,
mm,
psychologically,
mm,
identity wise. And I think one of the reasons why Andrew is such a flashpoint for so many people is because, both in the way that he operates, but also the issues that he sort of finds himself drawn to, he is often pushing and prodding at precisely the things that make people feel most uncomfortable or most under threat, or on the other hand, most affirmed if they share his
mm,
perspective. And so the arguments that he engages in, but also the arguments about him, have a kind of personal quality to them that I think it's not unique, but it's a certain kind of thing. And I think he's dealing with these arguments, like whether you're talking about trans people or you're talking about kind of race science or science, genetics and intelligence or things like that, or Israel Palestine is another one that he steps into. Um, and like when people are arguing about this stuff, like and this comes from my childhood in various
Mm,
ways. Like so much of me wants to say that's not really what you think you're arguing about. It. You think you're having this kind of rational political discussion about these things, and and that's like 30% of it. But 70% of it or 60% of it is like, who am I? What's my identity? What does this make me feel? Like, which side are you on? I
mm,
mean, it's also tribal and things like that. And I don't always know how to think about. Like, I don't always know how even what to say to people. One of the notes that people posted when I announced that we were doing this chat was something like Andrew said something anti-Semitic to me in some sort of comments section. Like, I just can't deal with him anymore. And
mm,
I think the implication was, that you shouldn't either. This is not somebody who's worth
mm.
your. This is not somebody who's worth your time. And I don't know without, I don't want to repeat a kind of, anonymous accusation in a sense against Andrew, but he said things on the record that people are like, I mean, even going back to the famous where he did this, he published an excerpt from Charles Murray and Herrnstein's book, The Bell Curve, and then he had kind of a symposium on it. But he sort of platformed, he legitimized in the eyes of a lot of people this discussion about whether different racial groups, racial populations have different kind of average IQs, right? And so from their perspective, that was like, there was no coming back from that, that he did this thing that was like, you know, put his thumb on the scale in this sort of profoundly destructive way on on a racist perspective, right? We should think about whether on average black people are less intelligent than white people, and I guess, but nobody really cares about this, white people are less intelligent than Asian people, and
No, no,
wherever
no. Sorry,
Jews get in the mix.
I would push back on that because I do think,
Which part of it?
um, well, just this idea that. Oh, well, the framing of it, I guess so, because it sounds like Andrew Sullivan one day woke up, just like Charles Murray one day woke up and say, "Hey, have you ever noticed that there are these IQ differences that we should make people aware of?" And I think this is where someone like Matt Iglesias, in his kind of critique of the bell curve, I think he goes to the
Yeah.
root of the thing, where he says, okay, there's all this controversy about the science, but actually, what was the purpose of the bell curve? Charles Murray was making a libertarian argument. He was saying there are all of these government programs that are trying to equalize outcomes, but it's ignoring the
Well,
fact that you're not starting with people who are equal.
well, I don't
And
want to
that's
get
why I'm
into a I
yeah.
don't want to get into a bell curve argument. Why is Andrew the person who keeps stepping into these into these issues?
Because he's from the outside, because the rest of the establishment don't want to look at the reality on the ground. And that became clear to me when you had this conversation with Naomi Kanakia on the woke anti-woke thing. And she had this character of Janine. And again, like I said, my first reaction was not very charitable because she gets this woman that said, like, she works in this field where black people are underrepresented, and now she feels that that is used as a racist argument. So now she feels that it is her duty to, like, I don't know, go out of her way to, like, promote black people. And again, if this is coming from a an honest place, fine. But I also feel like, I don't know. My first reaction is get a life. It's like there is a very painful history. You, as a white liberal, is not gonna you're not gonna change this. But you
Mm,
have to look at the facts on the ground in because that's the thing. If nobody published these kind of
yeah.
statistics in the 90s, guess what, Dan? I think the statistics still look the same. And everybody's sharing them on Twitter now or X.com. So it's like, what has this mentality of keeping these arguments away from the public, has that worked?
Well,
And
I
and,
think these
and
are really difficult questions, right? So at the same time, so let me see. Let me step back. Like, uh, so I've come up, I've given this example or this before on different episodes, the podcast. But Masha Gessen, the writer, is now, I think she's a staff writer for the New Yorker,
she now
wrote
refers to some themselves as M. Guessed,
M.
but
Gessen, right?
yeah.
M. Gessen wrote a piece at some point about Russia and Russian dissidents, and her kind of loose hypothesis that a lot of the important Russian dissidents were somewhere on the autism spectrum. And she may
Mm,
have even sort of roped in Greta Thunberg to sort of a larger hypothesis that that there might be an overrepresentation of people on the autism spectrum who are um, who are dissidents in totalitarian or authoritarian regimes, and the speculation was that there were all these kind of things that were papered over in sort of normal society, and then to an even more extreme level in a kind of authoritarian or totalitarian society, there are all these stories we publicly tell and assent to that are obscuring truth, their lies, or at best, in a society like America, they're kind of smoothing over complicate like topics that are divisive and difficult to process emotionally, politically, morally. And people on the spectrum come in, and it's like actually actively aversive to them when people are not being bluntly honest in
mm,
describing the world in the way that it looks to them, right? And so then they're just like, the internal distress is so great that they're just like, this is bullshit. Like, this is not, I'm looking at the world in front of me. This is not the world. I mean, it seems to me that's a little bit of what, or maybe that's a lot of what you're describing. Not that Andrew is on
mm,
the spectrum, but it's that kind of visceral aversion to where kind of polite society is either erecting taboos around certain topics, or just has agreed for, there's a kind of moment of sort of political passion and enthusiasm that leads to kind of propaganda, right? That it leads to
mm,
sort of stories that people like to tell themselves because it makes them feel good about themselves, or it allows them to evade some more complicated issue. And when that happens, and you can see that that happens around these topics like race, like transgender, politics and ideology and policies, um, like Israel Palestine, or things like that, these things that are incredibly divisive and uncomfortable. And our society comes up most of the time in kind of polite, not polite society, as normal society socializing. You come up with certain useful fictions, I think,
mm.
to deal with them, right? And Andrew like can't tolerate that. And on the one hand, I agree with you, like when you're talking about the bell curve and things like that. On the one hand, in the extreme, if we just paper over complicated topics indefinitely, they percolate up somewhere else and cause, probably in a more dysfunctional way. On the other hand, I do think there's a value to certain taboos in society. Like I think,
No, but
a
okay,
certain element of civilization is basically figuring out how to functionally kind of create socially useful fictions.
okay. So the bell curve issue that he published, like I said, I agree with you. I think it's good to see that as an effort to kind of dispel some of these social fictions. And then, but as you said, he also published a raft of replies
Right.
in this. So in terms of this needing taboos, if you fast forward to the current environment, you had last year, you had Andrea Longchu write a piece for New York Magazine saying that kids have the right to change sex. There should be no medical or psychological evaluation. And the argument that they can't consent is bogus because we expect them to consent to puberty. Now, to me, that is a very radical argument because it's basically saying that there is no such thing as human nature in terms of it's not it's not just saying sometimes it goes wrong and we should try and fix it. It's like no, everything is a choice. As far as I know, there were no arguments um posted
Mm,
against that. So it's like, and I'm not saying that people, voted for Trump because of one article that Andrea Long too wrote.
right.
But again, people who make this argument that say some debates are dangerous.
Right.
I mean, you don't have to think more than two steps ahead to say like how that she's probably the most prominent trans writer in America puts that basically writes the Republican attack ads for them. None of the editors that are involved in New York Magazine seem to care about these consequences. They care about the fact that, oh, it's got a clickbaity title. Everybody's talking about this. So that's what I just feel like. If we want to talk about media responsibility, let's do that. But then, you know, if people are going to criticize people like Andrew Sullivan, they have to kind of think about what situation was created by the kind of people that pushed out Andrew Sullivan, that pushed out Ezra Klein and Matt Iglesias from these kinds of institutions, often in the name of protecting marginalized people. But
Right.
to me, I feel, um,
Well, so I mean, is that that's
yeah.
your response in a sense to kind of where I began this, which is people are saying, why
Mm,
the fuck are you talking about this guy, right? And the explicit or implicit argument is he's crossed certain lines from which he just simply shouldn't be able to return into kind of, the good graces of the sort of mainstream intellectual political
mm,
society. And you're saying, well, that's an incredibly selective and kind of inconsistent and hypocritical perspective, because you have people over here on the left that are actually saying things that are sort of um like incredibly radical and potentially destructive, and nobody in our world call people might criticize them, but the suggestion that Andrea Long Chu should not be the topic of a conversation would be absurd, right? That would
mm.
strike people as absurd, right? The idea that somebody who advocated um abolishing the police, right? Which is an insane idea, right? Insane and sort of like insane, potentially insanely destructive idea. The idea that that person will be criticized, right? And I think a lot of people are kind of embarrassed now that they sort of loosely signed on to that perspective. But the idea that that writer who said that should be expelled from our world, from our milieu, is absurd, right? It wouldn't even occur to somebody.
Yeah,
Um,
and I think that is, and I've also thought a lot about this. Why again, like people are very quick to recognize something dangerous from the right, kind
right.
of poo-poo it when it comes from the left. And I think the reality is that we don't take threats from the left seriously because the people, and I think that comes from a genuine sense that these
Yeah,
people
that's my
are
question.
not an
Why?
actual threat, because I think that's where I've become to realize where I think Andrew goes off the rails is when he equates what he calls left authoritarianism with what you're seeing in Trump now. So again, he would criticize what's happening on Trump, and then he would say, oh, but what happened under Biden was just as bad. It just happened in the other direction. And
Right.
I actually think that is factually incorrect. But that is the way that a lot of people see things. And I think that's why when one thinks about harms, it's not just the harms that are done by actual trans people to other people. Again, trans people are not angels because they're people. There are
Right.
bad people that identify as trans and do bad things. The actual harms done is minuscule.
Right.
However, when you go and publish things on a public platform and you shout at J.K. Rowling that trans women are women, and all of this kind of snowball effect, I do think, again, if we're talking about being responsible, one has to think about how your message is being received.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that you don't criticize the way that people react. You can blame them, it's all on them. But again, if you're like in a democracy and these people actually have to vote on policies, you
Right.
have to be able to speak to them in a way. And I think that's where I guess
Well,
my
that's what.
greatest
So wait.
admiration for Andrew comes in is with the whole like gay marriage thing, where he kind of realized that the only way that you can get this as a sustainable right for people is not to go through the back door and try to like put it on and hope people don't notice, but actually go to people and say, you've got a problem with this. Why do you have a problem with the fact that I want to marry my boyfriend just like you married your girlfriend?
Yeah. So that's it. Okay. I'm trying to formulate my thoughts here, because there's some really interesting and kind of fruitful ideas there. Like, but I want to go back to this idea. Like that's a really interesting question. So why is it that people experience these ideas from the right as kind of danger? Your hypothesis is, why is there this double standard? I agree with you. There's this double standard, right? Andrew says something like, let's just say, for the sake of argument, that it's dangerous, or it feels dangerous in a way, right?
Mm,
um, People think that that's a kind of unforgivable offense. And then somebody says something on the left that's kind of equally absurd and sort of dangerous if taken seriously,
mm,
right? and yet it's just kind of like it's shrugged off essentially. Maybe we'll criticize it, but it's not experienced subjectively. Some of that is just tribal, right? It depends on which side you're on. But I think what you're saying is we don't actually take seriously, or a lot of us don't take seriously, that the crazy ideas on the left could be operationalized. Right, like that's like at a visceral sense, it's like the crazy ideas on the right. When you're thinking about racism, race science, it's like it's easy to conjure up Donald Trump, right? Like fucking
Mm,
Donald Trump, who is actively deploying the power of the state to operationalize some really bad right wing, awful right wing ideas, right? And then, but on the left, there's a kind of asymmetry, except Andrew, and this is like a really good point about Andrew, and I think it crystallized something that I had not been able to articulate to myself. Andrew doesn't see the asymmetry. Andrew says, look, the Biden administration had all these policies about equity and, um, gender trumps self-identified gender trumps sex, and I experience those, and it sounds like you experiences those. Like they're kind
mm.
of like, I mean, they're kind of bureaucratic, like they're like DEI
Yeah,
modules or something like
exactly.
that,
Like
like
it's like these they call e-learning, so you have to click
yeah,
through these.
right, and it's like
And it drives me insane. But calling that indoctrination,
right.
um,
And he
you
talks
know,
about these like affirmative action programs that I think, like, if you actually look at the money involved, and like, and then you look at how they play out downstream. I mean, preferential like hiring of contractors and hiring, like all of these things that actually seem to be pretty marginal and in some cases relatively functional parts of like the complex kludge that is like making a multicultural society work. He describes as though they are the equivalent of Trump, you know, doing what he's bringing to bear the power of the state against Harvard, and like denying visas for students who want to study at Harvard, like. And so there's this radical asymmetry that he doesn't experience always as an asymmetry.
yeah, and you get that again on like the sexuality issues as well, because I went back and actually read like Virtually Normal, which was a book-length argument basically for gay marriage and gays in the military as sort of um, the most important civil rights, but it was also, it wasn't just a legal argument, because the first chapter speaks specifically to other Catholics, and he argues against Catholic doctrine, and he basically wants to make the case that even within the Catholic Church, even if it goes against the letter of the law, it's within the spirit of the law to be kind of to err on the side of tolerance, and saying like, if you really think about like what Jesus would have said, would he like be holding up a God hates fags sign? I think anybody who has any familiarity with Christian tradition would know that, okay, yes, there are parts in the Bible, and yes, there's Catholic doctrine, but actually, like, what is the spirit that we're talking about? So he makes this argument from the religious side, and he obviously says that, okay, for much of human history, the attack, or the danger to gay men specifically, came from the right, came from religious traditions. But then the next chapter, he talks about what he then calls the liberationists,
Hmm.
and I think that's what we would now call like the queer movement.
Yeah.
This idea that actually, no, it's not just about people being born gay. The idea is we need to transcend all of these heterosexist, heteronormative, all of these kinds of things. And even back then in 1994, which I guess that was sort of the first round of these kind of politically correct kind of
Yeah.
controversies, Judith Butler had published Gender Trouble in 1991. So, and in the specific case of gay activism, there was this split between the radicals that said, no, actually, I don't want to get married. I don't want to be part of that
Yeah.
bourgeois institution. I don't want to fight in the military. Being gay actually means you reject all of that. And the way he expresses his argument against that is saying, again, that is just as dangerous to gay men as the traditional threats posed um, by by the church. And I think that's just so ridiculous, actually,
Right.
the more I think about it. But I wonder if part of it is because, in a sense, he wanted to have it both ways. He wanted to stay a Catholic. He wanted to kind of make it peace with that. And I think in the way he had to draw very clear lines to say like, okay, I'm gonna bend the dogma a little bit because, like I said, when I went back and the
Yeah.
doctrine of the Catholic Church is very clear. It says yes, it's an intrinsic disorder, but your vocation is celibacy.
Right.
And there are not a lot. I mean, Eve Tushnet is an interesting case of
Yeah.
someone who identifies. She wrote a book called Gay and Catholic,
Right.
but she says, I'm gay, I'm attracted to women.
Right. But I'm going to
But
practice celibacy.
exactly.
Yeah.
So, and I guess you could, I don't know if the difference between male and female, but again, traditionally as well, there are a lot of celibate people in the Catholic Church. They become priests.
Yeah. I was going to
And
say they're
obviously,
called priests. Yeah.
um, yeah. And again, if you want to be cynical, you can say, well, that's a wonderful recruitment tool for the Catholic Church, because otherwise, how are you gonna um, you know, make the case for a straight man to say you have to give up that in order to like have
Well,
this vocation?
so wait, so what is, I mean, I just like, go back to this question. What is the responsibility of the intellectual? Because I think the point you were making was, on the one hand, we kind of agree that Andrew sometimes kind of misconstrues the asymmetry between the left and the right and these ideas. But I think you were also saying actually there are consequences to left wing kind of idiocy as well. It looks different, right? And it plays out
Mm,
in a different way. I mean, whatever, it leads to the kind of backlash election of Trump or something like, we could come up with different sort of
mm.
like things. But I would so then the question becomes, well, or what I would say is, okay, like let's take that seriously as a responsibility of intellectuals and journalists and editors and things like that, not to be sort of blasé about publishing things that could have those consequences. But my response was, I don't think we should excommunicate any of these people. It's not that we should also be
Yeah, no,
excommunicating
exactly. I
Andrea
I
Long
think
Chu. Like, we should have room for Andrea Long Chu and Andrew Sullivan and Mary Jane Eyre and Daniel Oppenheimer. Like the criteria for excommunication from, I think there should be criteria. Like, I think people should be, like, I believe in a certain level of like taboos. I think people should be, there is a point at which people should be kind of exiled from mainstream conversation. But I don't think Andrew is anywhere close to it, and I don't think Andrea Long Chu's anywhere close to it.
no, I agree, and that's my biggest thing is like having more tolerance all around, and kind of because again, like that point that you make about the psychology driving like these political arguments, so to speak, I think that has become so apparent to me around, the fact that when we are under stress, when like a trauma or something is triggered, obviously we want to go back to something that's safe. And I've like really noticed that with like the Israel-Palestine thing. Whereas it's an issue that I'd always kind of followed, but obviously recently I've been like following it a lot more closely. But what has struck me since October 7th is just how the two narratives just are completely divergent. And
Yeah,
like I said, I'm no expert in this, but I know enough that when I read an article from a Jewish perspective, I can go, yes, 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 but you're leaving out something important there. It's like, oh, and the same from the Palestinian perspective.
right.
And so that's why I think we've moved past the idea that we have these broadcasters that are going to tell the truth to people and we should prevent people from having a platform.
Yeah.
I don't think that model works anymore because that's not how the internet operates. So I think Agnes Khaled has a book out called Open Socrates, which I've written a review for that will hopefully be published on Substack soon. And she makes a good point that basically saying the point of philosophy is to address an error.
Mm.
And and she said the whole point of thinking. We think of, oh, I think in my head, and then we have a discussion. She kind of turns it around and saying we can actually only think when we have someone to think with, because
Hmm.
otherwise we kind of get stuck in our own loops and our own projections, and we tell ourselves these stories that make us feel better about something. But if we have someone that's really annoying, like it's funny you brought up the autism point. I have this line in this piece where I make this joke where I say I think the whole of Western philosophy can be termed conversations on the spectrum, because
Right.
and because and I've seen theories that people, because like people, you know how they retrospectively
Yes.
call Joan of Arc non-binary now.
Yeah.
People go like, obviously Kant was autistic, obviously Wittgenstein was
Right.
autistic,
Right.
obviously Iris Murdoch was autistic, obviously Simone Weil. So it's very interesting. All the people I kind of vibe with, have been diagnosed. But I think I actually think it's a really important point, this idea of neurodiversity and all of that, because I
Yeah.
feel that, again, as someone who's like gay or queer, whatever you want to call it, to me, it comes down to that by itself is something neurodiverse. And I think that's where, again, all of these ideas of, oh, you can't call something abnormal because that will hurt someone's feelings. It's like there's no such thing as abnormality, all of those things. I just think that kind of sets people up for failure. And I think, in a sense, and this is where I think I also differ from a cultural perspective from most, I guess, left liberals in your milieu, I really resonate with this idea that people just need to be toughen up at some point,
Yeah.
and to say that there is this incredible injustice in the world, but you know what, like, we have to deal with it, and like curling into a fetal position and crying about it, or everybody moving to blue sky and you don't want to hear what anybody else says. I mean, again, it's like at some point you have to face reality.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting with Andrew, right? Because he is, I mean, he's an interesting figure from that perspective. He is somebody who's constantly pushing people precisely in that space, right? And so you're saying, you know, um, toughen up. And Andrew's constantly
Mm.
kind of in their face, kind of forcing them to either do that or walk
But
away,
I,
right?
but okay, but now I want to turn the tables and I want to tell Andrew to toughen up. And what I
Mm,
mean is this idea, and this is something that I've also thought a lot about, is this accusation of transphobia. And because again, I think if we take this psychological language seriously, if we call something an irrational fear, if we think of it in a personal way, if someone has an irrational fear of spiders, you know, shouting at them and shaking them, it's like, why do you have this irrational fear of spiders? You're stupid. They're not going to do anything for you. Um, Again, I'm not a psychologist, but I don't think that's a very effective mechanism.
right.
So if we, and the reason why I make this point is I've recognized in myself really that when I was following a lot of these gender debates, like you said, I have this kind of mindset about, but this doesn't make sense. This seems like a polite fiction. So I was drawn to people like Catherine Stock who make a philosophical argument to say like, okay, but a statement like trans woman as woman, it's one thing to make it in one context, but the idea that that then becomes the letter of the law in every single context, have we thought this through? And I think
Yeah.
that's the charitable the view, and I think that's where a lot of people started. But obviously, it then became very, 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 very toxic. But
Yeah. But so what
but
does it mean for Andrew to toughen up is what?
yeah, so sorry. So that's when I talk about the irrational fear. So I think there are legitimate criticisms to make about the fact that, okay, all of a sudden, there is this change in policy about, let's say, youth gender medicine or whatever. We don't have to get into specifics, but I think those are legitimate debates. But when Andrew then says, when he goes on Grinder and he sees a trans man, he feels that's an invasion of his rights as a gay man to assert his sexuality. And what I want to say is that's where I'm saying you need to toughen up.
Yeah.
You're like a 60-year-old man, you're on an app. The app allows you to block people
Right.
if you
Right.
don't want to interact with them. I I don't know how the situation is in the US. And this is why I feel I need to be honest about my own life in terms of having these conversations. Like, I am in an open relationship. I'm someone who uses Grinder. I have very, very mixed feelings about that. There are lots of things that I see on that platform that worry me. And I actually challenge anybody to download Grindr, spend 5 to 10 minutes on there, and conclude that the main threat to gay people is gender ideology.
Hmm.
So, um,
Somebody
what I
said Sullivan is just a grinder NIMBY.
no, exactly. And but when I wrote about this, I had another person who identifies as a gay Christian comment on my blog, and we had this, and they were talking about the fact that, because my point, again, to be crude, was the fact that, okay, I am not someone who wants to have sex with someone with a vagina. However, if I go to a sex club and I'm having sex with a man, if someone next to me has a vagina, okay, if I'm complaining about this, this is where I feel like people just need to get real here. And again, if you call yourself a gay Catholic, you do not kind of follow like what does the Pope say about you being on Grindr in the first place? So
Right.
again, that is my where do you come from? How are you throwing stones? And again, the reason why I see this as an irrational fear is he doesn't want to be confronted with the reality that there are people that have gone through this process that he may not disagree or that he might not agree with. He might think that was the wrong choice
Right.
that this person has made. He might think that this person was failed by their parents, failed by the medical establishment. And and so there's a lot of emotion that's attached to that. But I feel you have to be able to hold that, and these are my opinions, but also recognize that this is a person.
Yeah.
And this is a person who has a different self conception than the conception that I have of them. And I now want to impose my self conception on them. And again, that's why I said one needs to kind of differentiate between where it's like a proper discussion where there are actually conflicting rights. So when you're talking about, okay, you've got women's only bathrooms, and if the policy is that anyone can move in if they say I'm a woman, obviously you can see the potential conflict. Again, this is not
Yeah.
saying that this is an actual threat to people. But what I'm saying is, if you are talking about a situation where there is actually no threat to you, you are not prevented from being a homosexual by the fact that other people's sexuality is more kind of complex than that. And that's given me actually more sympathy for some arguments that I've kind of dismissed in the past about things like bi-visibility. This idea that all of a sudden you have a certain people that are so attached to this gay identity that have kind of reconstructed this view of the world that everybody's either gay or straight. And you've got gay spaces and you've got straight spaces. And that's why when you have trans people, they complicate that. But like I said, I've had to realize that, again, that's my personal perspective. I've never been attracted to like women or woman body people or anything like that. But I've had to realize that actually some people are heteroflexible or homoflexible
Yep.
or
Yep.
bisexual. Some people, again, if you actually look at Grindr, some people go there specifically to look for trans people.
Right.
The
Right.
world is more, and that's another piece that I
Well, I
really love
think,
about what
I
you,
mean,
yeah.
one way of saying that, I mean, there is I think I agree with you in a sort of critique of Andrew, which is, I mean, there's a lack of, I was going to say a lack of sensitivity or a lack of compassion. I mean, I think if you could imagine a conversation with Andrew, unfortunately, I think, and it may be who comes on the show, but oftentimes the trans people he has on the shows are the ones who are going to kind of affirm his general perspective
Mm,
on it.
mm,
But you can imagine somebody, I don't know who the person would be who would come on his podcast and say, "Look, Andrew, like sometimes when you're railing against, the authoritarian trans agenda, like you're forgetting that there's people here. Like you're forgetting the sort of Christian in you. Like what would Jesus do? Like
mm,
even if Jesus didn't agree with me on sort of the sort of legitimacy of trans identity, how would he deal with me? How would he talk to me? And would he talk to me? Would he rail against the authoritarianism of the trans agenda, or would he recognize
mm,
me as like a fellow soul, endowed with sort of divinity? And that is a failing of his when he's on his high horse. Is like, and I feel the same way about kind of a lot of how he's dealing with the complexities around discussions of like race, and sometimes the way he talks about black criminality lacks that kind of Christian compassion or sense of
mm,
empathy. It is a failure of his, and I think. you know, my ideal we never get the ideal version of the
Mm,
people we want, right? My ideal version of Andrew is somebody who does so many of the things he does, but remembers when he's on one of his, and it, frankly, I think it is different when he's railing against the torture regime,
mm,
the Bush Cheney torture regime, go to town, like go to fucking town on those
mm,
people and the evil of it. But when he's talking about people, a lot of whom are very vulnerable, like there, the ideal version of Andrew, and I have to sort of grieve that and come to terms with the Andrew we have, is somebody who would
yeah.
have more sense of the fact that he's talking about people, and often people who've gone through pretty excruciating experience. Like, it is not easy to be trans in the world. And so even if we have critiques of certain aspects of, the more kind of radical versions of trans ideology, like, to remember, depending on the space that you're in, that these are people who are experiencing difficult things. And so, but then, and then I'll say this, and then I'll let you sort of have the last word on Andrew. I think, like, given all that, and I think there's a legitimate critiques of him, and I think he could do a little bit of soul searching, on that front. Like, I think ultimately, in my kind of sense of what makes for a kind of healthy, pluralistic society, the function that he serves as somebody who not only kind of goes at these kind of areas of social fiction or obfuscate political obfuscation, but also hosts on his own platform everybody telling him he's full of shit, right? So,
Mm,
like, he'll say the thing, and then he'll have like pages and pages of saying, here's why you're wrong about this. And also somebody who's capable of changing his mind over time and coming to recognize ways in which he erred, most particularly with kind of the Iraq war. And I think he's now reckoning with that in terms of maybe underestimating kind of the threat of Trumpism, but also just being utterly willing to just turn on, like, stop, now most of what he's saying is attacking, Trumpism and things like that. Like, I think ultimately he is a benevolent force in society. He is somebody who kind of firms up the foundations of liberal democratic society more than he erodes them, but it doesn't mean that he's above critique. So maybe last
mm.
word, wherever you want to take it, last word to you on Andrew Sullivan.
No, I think I agree with you. And again, like my like pragmatic argument to people um is that the fact that he can tap into what people actually think, because I think that's the other reason why he's popular, and that's the reason why Trump is popular, right? Because people say like, "Oh, I listened to him. He sounds like my racist uncle in Queens," but it's
Right.
something, but it's something familiar, and because it sounds like an actual person. You listen to like Kamala Harris speak, and I'm sorry, like that's not something that when I listen
Well,
to her speak,
it's just
it's like
generic
she's a
politician speak, right?
exactly
Yeah.
like and that's why there was such a weird thing with like this whole coconut tree and like the most banal saying is then treated like, oh, she's like this fount of wisdom, and it's just fake. And I think that is the thing that maybe it's that's the big thing that I've realized. And people have all of these theories about obviously being homosexual. You have like specific you're attuned to this way in which people are fake because you kind
Hmm.
of grow up being a fake because in the sense that especially how I grew up, I did not conform to the stereotype of how you should be as a man.
Right.
And like, I felt the whole time I was trying to pretend to be a man and kind of realizing that that was what people saw as being a man. And to me, and this is something that Andrew talks about, and maybe kind of being it personal on the whole trans issue about the fact that he had a similar experience growing up in terms of people saw that he was not behaving like the other boys and that caused him like it's a very weird feeling if people kind of because you're basically told there's something wrong with you and
Right.
you've got no idea how to change that. And there's obviously that's one of the reasons why it can be still difficult for people to grow up gay even though it's more
Yes.
accepting. But then he saw puberty as an experience of growing into himself, and again, that was my own experience. And I think that is what people need to understand why there is this emotional reaction against things like puberty blockers, where you kind of say, like, we're not going to let things take its course.
Well, but I
And
think there's something else in what you're saying, and I'll let you get back to it. Is that
yeah,
is that is that part of his formation, we might imagine, is I'm not going to be fake. I'm not going to lie anymore. I'm not going to go
Mm.
along. I'm not, whatever you tell me, I have to say this thing that doesn't feel right to me. I'm not going to do that anymore. Like, I just refuse.
Yeah, exactly. And like, and there is a sense of self-righteousness that again I could recognize in myself because, like I said, what Richard Dawkins gave me was not just an argument. It was saying like, actually, I'm smarter than all of these people
Right.
around me.
Right.
And also, I am more kind of psychologically strong because I don't need these fairy tales about going to heaven and all of that. Um, Obviously, pride comes to a fall. Then I reached a point in my life where I realized, like, okay, shit. I understand why people believe in this stuff, even if it's like
Yeah.
not very plausible, etc. So I think that's the kind of my own journey thinking about, and to be soppy about it, I think that's like a great deal of how I see spirituality, really. And this is why I think someone like Iris Murdoch is so important, whereas she puts the emphasis on what is outside. So like I said, my blog is called The Extremely Difficult Realization, which is a quote from her where she says it's that love is extremely difficult realization, that something other than the self is real. And so much of and that's another point that I think Matthew Gaster makes very clearly in his novel is this whole sense of therapy of looking inward.
Mm,
We've tried that for a very long time, and it doesn't seem to be working. That at some point you have to kind of expand your view of the world and realize that everybody doesn't see things the way that you do. And you
right.
can get extremely upset about it. And you can find a community online that thinks exactly like you do. And you
Yeah.
can team up with them and go fight the people that think the opposite. And
Well,
that
and
can be a lot of fun.
Andrew is
But
enacting that drama between those two poles. I think that's part of what's so compelling. He's enacting
mm,
that drama between those two poles all the time, right? And in
mm,
front of us and sort of for our benefit. Between pride, I'm smarter than everybody else. I know more than you. I see the truth. You're captured by this illusion. And then I think on the other end, you know, there is a there's a kind of humility, or there's something that anchors him that tends to bring him back from the from the brink in certain ways. Maybe when he's a little, maybe he's not on notes and he's kind of noting or tweeting in the moment, but when he's kind of reflecting and writing a longer essay or a book or something like that. But I think he is enacting that sort of fundamental drama, which is so kind of central to the sort of politics of our time. And I mean, I think I've learned a lot from it. I mean, it doesn't he's subject to the flaws of it.
mm.
He is over he is prideful in ways that lead him astray, and that alienate people, and you can't blame the people for being alienated, but the his living life that way, this is going to sound a little sacrificial, like living his life that way for us, for our sins. I think
Yeah, and I think that's why.
there's an aspect of it that's kind of amazing. I don't know, like that's where I end up for all his flaws. Like there's a he's out there for us, taking
Yeah,
taking the
and like I
arrows.
said, I think as if we take like what a public intellectual is good for, like I said, someone who's honest about, almost honest despite himself, because that's the other thing. If you read someone like we've read Andrew Sullivan, I mean, you're not just reading what he says, you're kind of reading behind it. And like you
Yeah,
said, you're thinking about where is this coming from? And
yeah,
that is obviously again why we we read literature. And I think that is like one of the big themes that I've been thinking about is how, we've all kind of turned ourselves into characters online. Again, that's a cliche.
yeah.
And, for a lot of people, there's not a lot of effort. It's sort of a narcissistic character, right? Because you only post your like, holiday
Your
photos and
best
when you look
self.
at your best. And
Yeah,
I actually think there is real value in a style and because this style of what's called confessional writing, again, that is something that
you
is
have
like
1 minute to
female
wrap up
coded.
because I
Okay,
have a Zoom appointment with my psychiatrist to
okay,
evaluate how
okay,
things are going with my ADHD medication.
okay, great. So my last point is, like I said, there's like confession is an interesting genre to me because you obviously have that in the religious sense. You also recently have this thing about, especially young women talk about their sex life online. Um, and I actually think there is benefit in confession
Yeah,
if you then actually take that and think about it. But again, what's necessary is that compassion. Because
yeah,
if you're going to dissect someone, if you're going to look for a flaw in someone that's honest about who they really are, you're going to very easily find it. But
that's right.
like I said, if you look at it perspective, actually this person is a lot more honest, and that takes bravery and that takes courage. And then kind of, like you said, take it as a learning experience. Like if you get angry, ask, why am I so angry about this? And I think that kind of level of self-reflection is something that well, I guess I've had to do it in order to stay sane on the internet, basically. So that's all life advice that I feel qualified to give people.
Well, on that note, we've been admirably confessional in certain ways. Anyway, thanks for doing this, MJ, MJE, whoever you are.
Where I am.
Thanks, folks, for
Okay,
tuning
this was
in.
fun.
Yep, me
Thank
too.
you. Bye bye.